Hi, I recently collaborated on a video with Christian Davici where we talked about free plugins and libraries for sound design, and to show you how far you can go with them, I made a redesign of this super from Destiny 2, only using free plugins and free libraries. So let's break it down. Make sure to check out that original video to see exactly which libraries I'm using for this. First off, these cloth and metal recordings that make up this low mid layer. This is actually two different racks. The first one here is centered around M freeform phase, which lets you draw a little shape here and mess around with the phase of the sound. It gets you similar kind of sounds to disperser, but I like how it smears the transients and kind of makes everything into whooshes that sound kind of whippy rather than transient based. This rack is also using panks to kind of flatten the dynamics before a transient shaper tones them back into a classic impact shape. This is so I can take a source sound with a lot of dynamic movement like these cloth movements and make sure that wherever I put the playhead, it will always have a kind of trailing off impact dynamic shape. Subfilter and chorus here are just adding some weight and character to the sound, and then freeform phases at the end just to smear those transients a bit. Here's how that sounds. At the end, I'm arranging them like this and automating a high pass on these ones that hit on the main impact to leave room for the low end elements that I'm going to talk about later. The second group of low mid sounds are these more tonal whooshy elements that add a lot of noise and fill out the frequencies for the main impacts. The rack here is based around Doppler dome, and I'm actually using two of them here at slightly different speeds so that I get a more extreme pitch and volume ramps. And I'm not touching the pan scale here at all because I want to keep these mostly centered. After this, M ratio MB is taking out a lot of the clicky details that I don't want for this layer. I'm just trying to turn these into interesting sounding tonal background elements, so I don't really want them to catch your ear that much. Then Ven Audio's free EQ is a low pass here being modulated in reverb by the incoming signal volume for some more movement and to further take out that clicky brightness that I want to save for my other elements. I'm also putting these cloth movements through the rack, as well as this metal debris recording that had some nice kind of shouty resonances in the mid-range. Here's how that sounds. Now to arrange these, I tried to make a kind of natural building up and trailing off shape through the volume and pitch of the sound, so it feels like this power is naturally dissipating at the end. A few of the tracks have some reverb to give them more depth and make it feel like these fragments of energy are all coming from different directions and distances, which makes the super feel a bit more encompassing and massive because it's a super important player moment where they aren't going to be focusing on anything else. On the whole stack here, I have distortion to bring out those mid-frequency resonances more, another high pass to get them out of the way of the low-end stuff, and a pitch shifter that gets automated down over the course of the impact to further sell them losing energy over time. But here it is all together. My next group of sounds are all the granular textures I have. So the first group here is these really bright granular elements in the build-up. These were made in Quanta, and the source was this metal Foley and this plastic cheese wrapper. To make these sound more like proper risers, I made this ramping up envelope in the plugin and tied the number of grains to it as well as their pitch, so it gets more clustered and busy towards the apex of the ramp. I'm only high passing these, not really processing them anymore, and I have this little bit of metal Foley on the impact, just to add a little bit more tonality and tie the build up to the impact more. The other place I'm using Quanta is in the tail and sustain of the super, when the player is just passively hovering with the particles floating around them. I found this really cool cat purring recording and put it through with more of an ambient pad setting in the plugin. So here's what they sounded like straight out of Quanta. The first thing you probably notice about these is that they're really noisy. So I'm using M ratio MB as a subtle denoiser here, trying not to take out much of the high-end detail on the actual purrs. Then I have this bass purr texture, which is a bit more constant, and this one where I processed it slightly differently and just picked out individual little purrs that I liked and layered them on top. They're both being frequency shifted because I found that it kept the same clicky quality but moved a lot of those satisfying frequencies away from the low end and kind of further up towards the mids. And I'm doing some multi-band transient shaping on these intermittent ones with panks to make sure it pokes out more and to get rid of more of the noisy bits in the tails. I'm also using auto pan here to move it around a bit because I needed some more movement to match the visuals, and the dynamics of this sustain layer are quite flat, so any way I can add movement without changing the fundamental character of the sound is great. The last granular element here is this sustained tone, which is made from this whale song recording that I put into Quanta as a way of kind of washing it out and removing most of that random movement and detail, so I can just have it as an interesting tone. I'm frequency shifting again to get the main frequencies a little higher up and to change the relationships between some of the harmonics. Then vibrato and tremolo give it some more controlled movement and stop it from getting too piercing or annoying, which is always a possibility with sustained kind of notes like this. There are a lot of synthesized elements across this whole redesign, and they were all made in Vital, which goes to show how versatile it is. Firstly, I have the main tonal basses which sit under the impacts. These started with this patch, where I'm using the vocode control on some basic waveforms and adding loads of movement with the inbuilt effects and envelopes. I really like moving a notch filter with the envelope to make basses a bit more vowely. And then I have this second patch, which uses a lot of similar techniques, but is more kind of wobby and dubstep-like, using FM to give it a nice kind of sinister feel between the two fundamentals. Here's some of the results I got just by messing around with these patches. After arranging them, I use quite a lot of processing that mainly boils down to distortion, OTT to flatten the dynamics and make it more synthetic sounding, M ratio to smooth out the clicky high end, then delay and reverb to spatialize it and give it a more natural tail. I'm also using the pitch shifter trick on the tails after the reverb to make them trail off a little more naturally, and I have this automation on one of the elements to bring back the wobby filter movement after all that heavy processing. So here's what they all sound like together. The next synthesized element is these super distorted high-end synths. These were made by first getting a load of source from this rack using Vital. It uses 2 subfilters to massively blow out the low end before putting it through distortion and OTT to just kind of destroy the sound. The Vital patch isn't particularly crazy. It's a sustained saw bass with some FM and super short delay to add another kind of tone and more harmonics, alongside other effects that just have loads of modulation across all their parameters. It's really fun to just play across random notes in the plugin and record it all out in Global Sampler. I then accidentally put those bounced out results back onto the same track, so they all went through the processing again, and it sounded really cool. Here's how that sounds. So after bouncing that out, it was another case of chopping and arranging to get the shape I liked and add loads of high-end grit to the overall redesign. Processing here is quite minimal, just a high pass and an automated low pass to roll off that high end across the tail, as well as some reverb just for this one element. Altogether, they sound like this. So the next use of Vital is in these textures in the tail, which I got by putting a really simple sustained pad through M freeform phase twice, again with a lot of modulation in the patch for the processing to play off of. Here are the results I bounced out. Then I used 2 of these as little risers right at the start. And I used these 2 parts as the base layer of this sustained group, with 2 more M freeform phases and some frequency shifting to make them really light and unintrusive, so they sit nicely behind those more interesting granular layers I talked about earlier. And the final use of Vital here is just this sub that hits on the main impact. This is mainly to give the whole thing a nice crunch when it hits the distortion that I have on the master, but it also serves as a nice way to convey power. I find having a strong low tone feels a bit more powerful than just having a messy low end rumble, even if the volume and the amount of frequencies are the same. Having it be more clean conveys more power. This is pretty much just a triangle wave with a bit of distortion and a kilohertz stereo to make it mono. So there's a few elements I haven't mentioned yet because they don't really fit in with the other categories. Firstly is this ice. These are nearly unchanged ice cracking recordings that I found that just sound really good. And every time I tried to creatively process them, it just made them sound worse. So all I'm doing here is adding a little bit of delay, subtle distortion to crunch that high end a bit more, a high pass that I don't really need because the recordings don't have much low end anyway, and that same pitch shifter trick for some more natural trailing off. I do actually have this subtle layer with some ensemble, vibrato and pitch shifting to give it a little bit more of a sci-fi feel and low mid weight, but you can barely hear it really. So here's how all the ice sounds together. And the final elements here are these impacts that I'm using as kicks on the big explosions. I made these originally by going back to the very first rack I talked about, adding another transient shaper to get more attack and less sustain, and turning off M freeform phase to get these source sounds. Then I'm doing a lot more processing, which is just taking out the high end, adding more low end to distorting and compressing it to make it fatter, and basically turn them into more synthetic sounding kicks. And I also added this little explosion transient at the very end of making this redesign to give a bit of kind of high-end noise to the second kick. Onto the mixing now. To keep things from getting too crowded and muddy around the actual hits of the explosions, I have the whole impact and build-up groups sidechained to those kicks I just mentioned. So there's a clean low end on the actual hits, and that pumping effect I think helps to convey a lot of power, because it almost feels like the burst of energy at those points is so powerful, it's just overpowering all this other swirling energy, and helps differentiate the tone of the explosions without having to have as much dynamic movement. So I can keep it all pretty squashed and fat while having the transients be really easy to hear and pick out. I'm also using the trick I like doing with kilohertz stereo, where I automate the width of the impact group down to almost mono before throwing it back out super wide again on the explosion. It's just another way of adding movement without having to change the sound much, and I think a lot of the time you don't even notice it, but it adds a lot of tension and release. I'm also using the output volume of that impact stack to control a low shelf on the sustain group, so the low end of those purrs gets out of the way of the impact itself, but you can still have this powerful sounding sustain at the end with a lot of lows present. I'm also doing a little more EQ on that sustain group to give it a different frequency shape. Where the explosions are pretty scooped, this group feels a bit more warm and less bright. Lastly, on the redesign as a whole, I just have a little soft clip distortion from Fire to glue it all and add some crunch on those parts with a lot of low end. Then Panks is adding some more compression and high end down here, as well as having this automation to soften the transients overall at the start, then emphasize them more for the main impacts. Then M Saturator is adding some parallel distortion just for a little more crunch and glue. So here's how much difference the processing on the whole redesign makes. So that's everything for this redesign. If you want to see where I got these free libraries and plugins, be sure to check out the video over on Christian's channel, and also look at his breakdown where he attempted this same redesign with those same free plugins and libraries. I'll link both of them down below, and thanks for watching.